On today's episode of Alex and Autos, we're out here taking a look at the 2017 Ford Fusion Energi. This is Ford's plug-in hybrid sedan, and you can actually think of this as not just competition for the hybrid Sonata or the hybrid Optima, but also something like a plug-in hybrid luxury car like a BMW 330e or even a BMW i3 with the range extender. That's not only because plug-in hybrids tend to have strange bedfellows, but also because 2017 brings us a refreshed exterior and a very luxurious brand new interior in the very top-end trim of the Fusion. The majority of the styling is the same as the last generation Fusion, but they've actually brought some of the luxury trappings that we saw in the European Ford Mondeo down here to the American Ford Fusion. Because this general design has been so well received, Ford decided not to change the look too much. We do have an entirely new front end, but the styling is very similar to the 2016 model year. We get angrier LED headlamps up front with these LED accent strips that also function as the turn signals, just as you can see over there on the other side. The grille is essentially the same shape as last year's, although it's become a little bit smaller, and we have a very different grille treatment in this top end trim. We have LED fog lamps down below, and the look overall has become a little bit angrier, a little bit meaner, and definitely a little bit sleeker as well. At 191.7 inches long, the Fusion is still on the longer end of this scale. As you might notice when you're comparing this to luxury vehicles like the BMW 330e, the Ford Fusion is actually more BMW 5 Series sized than BMW 3 Series sized. This is sold in Europe as the European Ford Mondeo, and in Europe, the Mondeo is a very large vehicle. In the United States, of course, this is called a mid-size sedan, but mid-size sedans really have become quite large. Thanks to the sexy side profile and the very attractive front end, I think the Ford Fusion is easily the most attractive entry in this segment. I think this 2017 refresh beats the current generation Mazda 6 in terms of the overall exterior design. However, there is an important thing to keep in mind. This very sexy side profile right here that helps give the Fusion this very attractive, very luxury sedan-like look does cut down on the rear headroom. Changes to the rear are a little bit less dramatic than the rest of the vehicle, although we do now have this chrome strip that bisects the tail lamp modules and then runs right across the tail all the way to the other side of the vehicle. It helps tie the lamp modules from one side to the other just a little bit better than before. You'll still find the center-mounted brake light up at the top of the glass, and we still find a single exhaust tip on the plug-in hybrid model. One of the interesting things about the Fusion is that there are easily more ways to customize your Ford Fusion than any of the other options in this segment. There are more gadgets available, there are more gizmos available, there are more luxury options, more features, and more variety of standalone options that you can mix and match to create a vehicle that is just a little bit more to your tastes. Part of the way we get there is the fact that there are not one, not two, not even three or four or even five different drivetrain choices. There are actually 6 different drivetrain choices for 2017 under this hood. Things start out with a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder engine producing 175 horsepower. That's very similar to what we see in the rest of the competition. From that point, we get 3 different turbocharged engines, a 1.5-liter turbo, a 2-liter turbo, and a 2.7-liter twin-turbo V6 producing 325 horsepower. For those that are looking for a touch of hybrid in their mid-size sedan, Ford then offers 2 hybrid models, a regular hybrid and a plug-in hybrid, which is the one we're taking a look at right here. They're both based around a 2-liter 4-cylinder Atkinson cycle engine that produces 141 horsepower and 129 pound-feet of torque all on its own. The engine is mated to a hybrid transaxle over here on this side of the hood that is very similar in terms of general design theme to what we see in the Chevy Volt, the Chevy Malibu, and the Toyota hybrid products. It's a single planetary gear set and 2 motor generator units. In the standard hybrid Fusion, the motor generator units and the engine combine to give you 188 horsepower and 42 miles per gallon combined in the 2017 EPA cycle. If you get the plug-in model that we're testing right here, then we get a 7.6 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack in the trunk, up from 1.4 in the regular hybrid model, and that gives you 21 miles of electric-only range. You'll notice a distinct performance difference between this vehicle in electric-only mode and in hybrid mode because it uses the larger of the 2 electric motors right here inside the transaxle in order to drive this vehicle in electric-only mode, but it's going to produce significantly less power than the engine that's over there on the other side of the hood. Fuel economy comes in at an identical 42 miles per gallon combined when you're operating under gasoline motivation. And if you want to charge the battery, it will take between 7.5 hours at 120 volts or 2.5 at 240. Now let's talk about how this plug-in hybrid system stacks up against the competition. The important thing to note is that not every plug-in hybrid works the same way, and they're not all designed to do the same thing. The i3 is at its heart an electric vehicle. It's available as a pure EV or as an EV with a range extender. And this is not what GM was talking about with the first generation Volt. This is definitely a range extender. They put a 2-cylinder motorcycle engine in the back, connected to a generator, and then after the battery is depleted, it will try and give some power back to the vehicle. It will never charge the battery more than 5% in the United States. It will only give you about 80 miles of range because we have about a 2-gallon gas tank in that vehicle, and it's not designed to operate the i3 at high speeds. On the other end of the scale, we have the BMW 330e. This really is a hybrid with a bigger battery pack, and they haven't changed the software too much. It will drive in electric-only mode, but the range is quite short for the plug-in hybrid segment, and performance when it's in EV mode is very, very different than when it's in the hybrid mode. It's considerably slower. The Chevy Volt lands right in the middle of this segment, and I'm not just talking about the EV range, which at 53 miles is pretty much halfway between something like a BMW 330e and a BMW i3 range extender. I'm talking about the overall intent of the Chevy Volt. When you drive a Volt in EV-only mode or in hybrid mode, it's going to feel almost the same. The 0 to 60 time is almost identical. They're only a few tenths of a second off one another. That's different than the Ford Fusion Energi or any of the other entries in this particular segment. There are, of course, compromises in making the Chevy Volt this very middle-of-the-road option. When it's operating in hybrid mode, the fuel economy is not going to be quite as good as the Prius plug-in, and when it's operating in EV mode, the EV fuel economy is not going to be quite as good as some pure EVs out there. However, it is going to give you a very consistent driving experience, whether it has battery power or not. The Ford Fusion Energi and the C-Max Energi slot somewhere between a Chevy Volt and the BMW 330e in terms of overall intent of the design. This produces either 188 system horsepower or 195 system horsepower depending on the state of charge of the battery. If we're in charge deplete mode, we actually get a boost over the regular hybrid model to 195 horsepower. However, if this is operating in electric-only drive mode, we get 118 horsepower. Because of that difference in power, acceleration times when we're in EV mode are going to be slower than when we're in hybrid mode. However, the delta is not quite as large as we see in something like an Audi A3 Etron or the first generation of the Prius plug-in. Although the EV mode and hybrid mode acceleration times are further apart than we see in something like a Chevy Volt, very much like the Chevy Volt, this can operate in EV mode all the time because it does have an electric air conditioning compressor and it has an electric cabin heater. So this will operate in cold weather or hot weather without turning on the engine. As you'd expect from a top-end Platinum trim, front seat comfort is excellent, although I do have to deduct 1 point from this seat because the seat bottom cushion isn't terribly long for my 6-foot frame. We do have a power tilt telescopic steering column that is memory linked and of course a 2-way adjustable lumbar support. When it comes to rear seat comfort, I'm going to give this 7 out of 10 points. We do have a generous amount of legroom. I have about 3 inches of legroom left sitting right here behind myself. I'm sitting a little bit further back in this front seat than I normally do just because of the overall shape of the vehicle. However, headroom really is the problem back here. If I sit upright in this seat, my head is touching the ceiling. Now we do get a little bit more headroom than we found in the Chrysler 200, but this is overall one of the tighter vehicles out back in terms of headroom. So if you're a taller rear passenger, definitely keep that in mind. Scooting over here to the middle seat, you'll notice that the back seat is fairly wide for this segment, but I have even less headroom. I have to cock my head to one side in order to sit back here. However, thanks to the overall length of the Fusion with this front seat all the way back in its tracks, suitable for a passenger that was 6'5" in the vehicle, my knees are barely touching the seat, but again, I have the same headroom issue. Going back to my strange bedfellow statement earlier, you will definitely find more room in this rear passenger compartment than you will find in a BMW 330e, the Prius Prime, or a Chevy Volt. Thankfully, Ford decided to keep the split 60/40 folding rear seat back, and that means that we have this approximately 5-inch tall slot right here that you could use for IKEA furniture, skis, or perhaps even a surfboard. When it comes to our new bag test, the shape of this cargo area is a little bit more important than its overall size. Because of course we have that cargo slot that I showed you a little bit earlier, but because of the way that slot is arranged, it means we can only fit one of these 24-inch roller bags right here in the cargo area. The cargo area is not deep enough to allow you to put 2 in this position. They just won't fit. You also can't put 1 right here on the bottom of the cargo area because it's just not quite large enough either. That means that we are left with enough room for just one of those bags right there with some extra luggage around it. When it comes to our exclusive trunk comfort index, I'm going to give this 4 out of 10 points. The cargo area is very compact, but there is a tiny amount of extra storage space right here under the load floor, And the Energi retains the very helpful handle to help close the trunk lid that we see in the regular Fusion. A lot of mid-size sedans cheap out on the trunk handle, leaving you to paw on the painted edges of the exterior of the vehicle. One of the big changes for 2017 is this new Platinum interior. This is easily the best interior that we have ever seen in a Ford Fusion. We have this contrasting piping, ventilated seats with quilted leather going on, and that quilted leather continues right over here to the front doors, where we'll find more soft touch plastics than we typically find in the mid-size sedan segment. This interior in general feels very much like a near luxury sedan. I would actually say this interior tops something like an Acura TLX in terms of its overall feel. One big change is that we now have real leather on the upper section of the doors. However, the mid-section of the door and the lower section of the door, those are still composed of hard-touch plastics like we find in the regular Ford Fusion. The overall design has not changed too much from the 2016 model year Fusion. We still have a large bin-style and slot-style glove compartment. There's a shelf right there, and it was able to accommodate large tablet computers. We still have very similar trim to the last generation model, but the big change is right above it. The dashboard and top-end trims is now a full stitched leather component. This is very interesting because we don't normally find mass-market vehicles sporting full leather dashboards. Adding leather to the dashboard and the upper portions of the doors really make this interior feel much more premium than any other entry in this segment. Moving down from that, we still find two large air vents in the center of this console, and we now have Sync 3 inside the cabin. Sync 3 now supports Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration. If you want to know more about this infotainment system, be sure and click that link down there at the bottom of the screen. Since the Fusion launch, there have been some gentle changes to the controls, so we now have a few more physical buttons going on right here, so you can control heated seats, ventilated seats, or the climate control system from physical buttons, as well as the Sync 3 infotainment system. Below the controls for the climate control system, we find a single USB input and a 12-volt power port with a large storage compartment that's a little bit larger than before, and we now have a storage slot right here in front of the shifter. The shifter changed to a dial mechanism in order to give us that extra space and larger cup holders, because this dial shifter takes up less room than the previous design. If you want to go on over to drive, we simply rotate this ring. If you want low, we press it right down there in the middle to enable or disable this. One of the benefits of this particular design is that when you turn the car off, it will automatically put itself in park. Behind the shifter, we have the control for the electric parking brake. You'll also find two large cup holders, the controls for the EV system. This allows us to go into EV Now, EV Reserved, and the Auto mode, which will switch between EV and hybrid operation depending on what you're commanding the vehicle to do. We have a button to enable and disable the parking sensors. We have the self-parking system button on this particular vehicle. It will parallel or perpendicular park you. And then we have a hill grade assist button. This is not hill descent control. It's simply telling the vehicle that you're planning on going up or down hills, so it'll help coordinate the regenerative braking system to be a little bit more effective. Between the front seats, we have a leather-coated armrest. This opens in two different ways to reveal one storage cubby right here that also lifts out of the way. And inside, you'll find another USB port, so that way you don't have to have your USB charging cable dangling all over the dashboard like I did. We have another 12-volt power port, and then a quite large storage compartment for this segment. The instrument cluster hasn't really changed for 2017, so we still have a large central speedometer with LCDs on either side. The LCDs are controlled via two different joystick button arrays on the left and the right side of the steering wheel. The one on the left here controls the LCD on the left. The one on the right side of the steering wheel controls the LCD on the right. The left LCD is where we find things like our fuel gauge, our battery gauge, a driving reminder to tell you how green you're driving, your trip computer information, a digital speedometer, and we also can change certain vehicle settings. So we can click right down here to settings. We can change the way the driver assistance systems behave, the way the MyKey system behaves, or what's displayed on this screen. The LCD on the right side of the instrument cluster is devoted mainly to infotainment. So we can see our entertainment source if we had that enabled, what was playing. You can change sources. You can also browse your call lists, things like your incoming calls, outgoing calls, missed calls. In addition to viewing a compass readout on the navigation display, you can also go home, see previous destinations, favorites, or points of interest near the vehicle. Then we have a fuel economy screen, which is a little unique to the hybrid model, where you can see our running fuel economy history. We can see the braking coach, very similar to what we saw on the other side of the vehicle, and then we have Ford's efficiency leaves. In theory, the more efficiently you're driving, the more leaves will grow on this plant. The less efficiently you're driving, leaves will actually start to fall off. The steering wheel is essentially unchanged from the 2016 model year. We have those button modules I showed you earlier and sport grips right above them. Below those button modules, you'll find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control that our model has: on, off, cancel, up, down, and then distance increase, decrease. On the right side of the wheel, we have track forward backward that also serve as phone hang-up pickup, volume up down, a mute button, and a voice command button. As I said before, your acceleration times from 0 to 60 will depend on what drive mode you're in. The hybrid drive mode is the slowest mode in this vehicle at 8 seconds 0 to 60. If you're in charge deplete mode, and that means that the EV portion of the battery has at least some capacity to it, then that drops down to 7.9 seconds. If, however, you're in the EV only mode, then it will actually take you 15 seconds to go from 0 to 60, which is about the same time that it takes the Prius Prime to go from 0 to 60 in its EV mode. 7.9 seconds 0 to 60 is a very good acceleration score for a mid-sized hybrid sedan, either in the near luxury segment or in the luxury segment actually. This is just about as fast as a Lexus ES350 hybrid. However, in the EV only mode, this is definitely going to be slower than most pure EVs out there. So something like a Kia Soul EV or a Nissan Leaf EV, they're actually going to be faster 0 to 60 in the EV only mode. However, Ford lets you choose, because we do have that auto mode, which will try and keep the vehicle in EV only mode regardless of the climate, regardless of your throttle position, except if you floor the vehicle. And then it will actually engage the gasoline engine and give you the best acceleration time. Thanks to the wide 225 with tires that we find on this hybrid model, our braking score is fairly good for a hybrid at 130 feet from 60 to 0. The Fusion has long been one of the best handling entries in this segment, and that translates right here to the plug-in hybrid model. This is easily one of the best handling hybrids available. You can thank not only the wide tires, but also the excellent suspension tuning in this vehicle. This suspension is not rock hard. In fact, it actually is very, very comfortable for long highway trips, yet we don't get as much body roll in the corners as you'll find in Toyota Camry, and we definitely don't get as much tip and dive as you'll find in some of the soft entries as well. That's even though we have some of the best road holding numbers available. Thanks to the excellent suspension design and Ford's tire choice, this has an excellent highway ride, and it also does an admirable job of soaking up bumps out here on this poorly paved mountain road. Unlike some of the softer vehicles out there, however, the Fusion doesn't feel unsettled over broken pavement in the corners. And that's a big difference between this and something like the Hyundai Sonata plug-in, which can feel a little unsettled in the rear. Regardless of which drive mode you're in, the cabin in the Fusion is very quiet. The quietest, of course, will be in the EV drive mode, where we scored 69 decibels at 50 miles an hour. In hybrid mode, with the engine running at 50 miles an hour, this was just 1 decibel louder. Fuel economy is a little tricky to talk about. In terms of electric fuel economy and gasoline fuel economy, the Energi is actually towards the lower end of the plug-in hybrid spectrum. However, 42 miles per gallon in a sedan that is this large is still quite good, and it really depends on what you plan on comparing the Fusion Energi to. If you're comparing the Fusion Energi to something like an Acura TLX, which I think you could very logically do, this interior is honestly nicer than the Acura TLX interior. The engine is just about as powerful, just about as quick 0 to 60 as the 4-cylinder Acura TLX. You will get considerably better fuel economy in this than the Acura. However, as far as pure hybrid vehicles go, this is going to pale in comparison to the brand new Prius Prime, which does get 54 miles per gallon once the battery is depleted, and also beats this in terms of its electric fuel efficiency. Now, when you start cracking the numbers, you'd think that the Chevy Volt would be less expensive to operate than the Ford Fusion Energi because of its longer EV range. Again, 53 miles in that, 18 miles in this, and you would be right. However, the delta would be much smaller than you might think. The reason for that is that the actual cost of operating a Chevy Volt or this Ford Fusion Energi on either gasoline or electricity is quite similar. But beyond that, the cost of operating this for 18 miles on gasoline or this for 18 miles on electricity is also quite similar. That means that for the average American's driving cycle, as defined by the EPA, this is only going to cost you $50 more to operate a year than a Chevy Volt, and you'll get a much nicer car for your dollar. Remember that in this video, we're talking primarily about the plug-in hybrid. The plug-in hybrid starts at $31,125, which is about a $6,000 increase over the base hybrid model. The primary reason for that is that the Energi model comes only in the SE trim, whereas the hybrid does come in the base S trim. Ford has been very aggressive at driving the base price in the Fusion Hybrid very, very low in the United States. However, they're not quite as aggressive with the Energi model. The Energi model really should be seen as more of an upper-end trim of the Fusion. As a result, all of the plug-in Fusions come standard with keyless entry and keyless go, active noise cancellation, the LED headlamps, and power leather seats. Stepping up to the Energi Titanium gives you the ambient lighting that we saw in our particular model, the Sony 12-speaker audio system, and a 10-way power passenger seat, which you don't get in the Energi SE. In the Energi SE, the passenger seat is powered, but it's only a 6-way version. Of course, we've been driving the top-end Energi Platinum, and the real surprising thing on the Energi Platinum is that the price tag doesn't really go over $40,000 by much. A base Energi Platinum is $40,650, and there are really only two options, whether you want the 17 or 18-inch wheels, and whether you want some of the snazzier paint options that will cost you nearly $500 to select. Any way you slice it, however, you can't get the Energi Platinum over $42,000. As I said at the beginning of this video, electrification makes for some strange bedfellows, and that's really why we're taking a look at a wide variety of different plug-in vehicles on this chart right here. There are two important things to remember about the IRS tax credits on plug-in vehicles. The first is that it may not apply to everybody. You really have to check with your tax professional to decide whether or not you qualify for those tax credits. And the second thing is that it's based on the size of the battery in the vehicle. And that's why something like an Audi A3 Etron gets a $4,500 tax credit, whereas the Chevy Volt gets a $7,500 tax credit. Because of the relative size of the battery that we see in the Ford Energi, it gets one of the smaller credits available in the US at $4,007. There may also be state tax credits available, but again, you should check with your state and your tax professional to be sure that those apply to you. Some states will also let you drive your plug-in hybrid in the carpool lane, so it's another thing to keep in mind. California recently ran out of green carpool stickers, and then they decided to throw a little bit more back into the pool. So at this point in time, you can get a Ford Energi and then apply for those stickers to drive back in the carpool lane. You'll notice at the bottom of the chart that the BMW 330e, the i3 range extender, and the Audi A3 e-tron all end up between about $35,000 and $40,000 after those tax credits, so you'll really see why we're talking about those vehicles along with the Energi Platinum. Of course, those are base prices for the BMW and the Audi, not top-end prices, and you can get your Audi A3 e-tron up to about $50,000 before its tax credit, so it will be significantly more expensive than the Ford at the top end, but it's a decent comparison down here at the bottom. When looking at any of the plug-in vehicles on the market right now, you need to define how long your commute is and how long you really need that battery range to be. As you can see, the electric-only range is all over the map. We get 14 miles per gallon out of the BMW 330e, or you can get 97 miles per gallon out of the BMW i3 range extender. You'll also note on this chart that there is a penalty to be paid for that long EV range, because when the i3 depletes its battery, you're only going to be getting about 35 miles per gallon out of that vehicle, even though it is a two-cylinder engine. Because we have been driving the Fusion Platinum, let's talk about the BMW 330e first. The BMW 330e has a slightly shorter range, and it gets 7 mile per gallon lower fuel economy when the EV range is depleted versus the Ford Fusion Energi. It also has a little bit less power when it's in the EV only mode, about 87 horsepower versus 118 in the Ford. Despite that, the BMW 330e will be slightly faster 0 to 60 in its EV mode and significantly faster than the Fusion when it's in its hybrid mode. Obviously, the BMW is a luxury branded vehicle, but I have to say that the Fusion does very well for itself in this comparison. It's very attractive on the outside, and I have to say that the interior is in some ways better than the BMW interior, especially for the price tag. For that $40,000 price tag in the Ford, we get a stitched leather dashboard, which you just don't see in the BMW. Sort of like we see in the BMW, the Hyundai Sonata and the Kia Optima hybrids use an electric motor and a traditional automatic transmission. In the case of the Sonata and the Optima, it's a 6-speed front-wheel drive transmission. The hybrid drivetrain that's used in the Sonata and the Optima is a little bit interesting because the system flows power from the engine to the electric motor and then to the transmission and then to the wheels. That means that when you're driving in EV mode, the power is still going through the automatic transmission. But it also means that when you're regenerative braking, the power is flowing backwards through the automatic transmission to the electric motor. So as you're slowing down in the Sonata, the transmission has to keep downshifting in order to keep the electric motor at the right RPMs for the best regenerative braking. The plug-in version of the Sonata gets a bigger battery and a more powerful electric motor versus the regular hybrid, but it's not as powerful as the motor that we see in the Ford. You get about 67 horsepower versus 118 in the Ford. That means the Ford is much more able to stay in that electric-only drive mode than the Sonata. If you're climbing a hill, for instance, like the hills that I live on, the Sonata has to turn on the gasoline engine in order to climb the hill. The Volt is an interesting option in this segment because it's never really been an EV with a backup plan in the same way that the BMW i3 has been. It's really more of a vehicle that sits on the fence between the EV world and the regular hybrid world. 0 to 60 performance is a little bit faster in hybrid mode, but the difference is so small that the average driver is unlikely to notice. Now the Volt is a little bit less expensive than the Ford Fusion Energi, and it has a much bigger battery, so you can really tell where the development cash was going in the Volt. As a result, the interior is far less premium than we see inside the Ford Fusion Energi. I would actually say that the interior of the Volt is a little bit more similar to the average compact sedan, something along the lines of a Ford Focus, than a Ford Fusion. That's quite logical because the Volt is actually a little bit smaller than the Ford Fusion as well. Although the Volt has a fifth seat and a fifth seat belt these days, the rear passenger compartment is just not as accommodating or as comfortable as what we find in the Fusion Energi, especially that center seat. As I said before, the Volt is a little bit less expensive to operate than the Fusion Energi on a yearly cycle. However, the difference is going to be fairly small. So the big difference in terms of operational cost really is going to come down to the purchase price. The Volt is less expensive than the Fusion Energi, but Ford has been pretty aggressive at putting some extra cash on the hood of the Fusion lately. The new entry in this segment is the Prius Prime, and the two big things to know about the Prius Prime are that it has no fifth seat in the back, it's a 4-seat only, and it has the highest fuel economy by far in this segment. It actually manages to be 2 miles per gallon better than the regular Prius. The second most important thing to know about the Prius Prime is that it is quite inexpensive in this segment. It starts just over $22,000 after the federal tax credits. That means it is quite simply the least expensive plug-in to own in the United States at this time. It's also going to be the least expensive plug-in to operate, even though it has a smaller EV range than the Chevy Volt. That's because after it operates for that 22 miles on electricity, it's getting 54 miles per gallon, which is significantly higher than the Volt or the Ford Fusion Energi or any of the other options in this segment. Last up, we have the Audi A3 e-tron. The e-tron drivetrain is not available in the convertible or in the sedan form of the Audi A3. It's only available in the sort of station wagon meets hatchback version of the A3, and that is a little bit different than the other entries in this segment. The drivetrain design in the e-tron is very similar to the BMW and the Hyundai hybrids. We have that gasoline engine, then we have an electric motor, and then we have a 6-speed transmission, and then the wheels. The only real difference is that in the A3 e-tron, it's a 6-speed dual-clutch transmission, not a traditional automatic. The overall operation of the drivetrain is very smooth and very refined. Unfortunately, the range and the fuel economy are fairly disappointing. The range is 14 miles in EV-only range, depending on how well you treat the vehicle, and the fuel economy ends up being about 34 miles per gallon once that battery is depleted. That's one of the lowest in this segment. It only really beats the BMW 330e, which is significantly more powerful than the A3 e-tron. In addition to that, the A3 e-tron gets fairly expensive. Like the BMW hybrids, you can get it over $50,000 before the tax credit if you get carried away with the options. That means it's significantly more expensive than the Ford Fusion Energi. My bottom line in the plug-in hybrid segment at this time may surprise you because my top pick is actually the EV with the backup plan, the BMW i3 with the range extender. I'm not quite clear why I like the i3 so much, but it's an awful lot of fun. It's different than every other entry out there, and it's very, very practical. Even though the i3 overall is quite compact, the back seat is very usable, and you actually get more headroom in the back than you find in the Ford Fusion Energi. The i3 has also become more practical for 2017, with an EV range that is at least 20% larger than it was in 2016. Of course, the futuristic, funky design of the A3 also plays into my decision. The runner-up for me, however, would be the Ford Fusion Energi, especially in the Platinum trim. I'm actually a little bit surprised that the Platinum model exists, because if I were Ford, I would have put the plug-in hybrid drivetrain in the Lincoln MKZ and then just charged more for it. And last but not least, if you're looking for the most efficient or simply the least expensive to operate in this segment, you can't go wrong with the all-new Prius Prime. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes. Be sure and hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen. Check out those related videos on the side of your screen. You can also find us over at patreon.com if you want to support this channel, and over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos to get all of the daily updates. I'll see you next week.